Welcome to RGES World Literature. This is Lesson 33 on Les Miserables, and we'll be doing Part 4 today, or Section 4, called The Epoch on the Rue Saint-Denis, or Denis, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, and The Idyll of the Rue Plumet, or Plumet. Not sure exactly, again, there either. So let's talk about a few key ideas here. We have these two streets in the title. A rue is a street, okay? We have the Rue Saint-Denis or Denis, I'm not sure. I don't think you were going to pronounce that S, final S, but that's all right. Pronounce it how it's going to be easiest for you to spell it. Okay. And this is where the revolution, this is the barricade, the scene of the barricade. And recall that this is a revolution. It's a very short revolution. It lasts about a month. It's called the Revolution of July. And it's basically a short uprising. And we are in the middle of, in the history of France, where they are changing. They of course had the bloody revolution. They had the Napoleon, and that moved from kind of an attempt to provide order to more and more of an emperor, and then we have the restoration of the king. And then we eventually it moves more and more into a democracy. So it's kind of more of a tumultuous transition than we had here in America, but quite a bit more tumultuous. But eventually it moves. So this revolution of July is a very short. It's a 1-month uprising that just continues to help that process move forward of becoming giving greater liberties to the people. So this is that street, the street of, now it's not where the major part of the insurrection takes place. That's a few streets over. But it is a skirmish. And the reason he selects a skirmish, I believe, one of the reasons Victor Hugo does that, is because he's showing that the history books hit the main ideas, or the main places, the most significant, quote-unquote, things that happen, but there's the microcosm, the story of the individual that's going on as well. And there's these few people, 50 people, here that are standing against an extreme number of people, okay? And these die almost to the person. And so they're giving their lives up. There's the heroism of the individual in the midst of what would not make, quote unquote, the history books. So just, he does this, by the way, this tension between the individual and society. Not tension as though they're opposed to one another necessarily, but that one influences the other and vice versa. For better or for worse, as we talked about in our devotion today. This is a big key to Victor Hugo's worldview, understanding of the way things are. He doesn't want the society to be off the hook, but he also extols the choices and the impact of the individual to influence the society, as well as the impact of society to influence the individual. So the section is called, remember, The Epoch on the Rue Saint-Denis. So in other words, this powerful story in the midst of a microcosm that doesn't make a powerful story in the history books. That's why he calls it an epic. It is all those things we do not see. The blip, okay, the small piece in light of the larger, and yet it is there. And then the other one, the ideal, the story of the idyllic story, the story of beauty, even in the midst, on the rue, the next street, the rue street, right? Plumet or Plumet, probably Plumet. Okay, and this is where the romance occurs, the courtship in the garden, between Cosette and Marius. And this, of course, is where Cosette and Jean Valjean are living at the time. So we'll be going back into a little more detail between these, but I want you to remember these names, these streets. Now, the first section we could look at is Thénardier. Thénardier, remember, has been in prison, and even while he's in prison, and the others have been put into prison after the affair up at the old Garbeau house, where Javert comes in, and everybody gets arrested, except, of course, Jean Valjean, who escapes during the midst of the confusion. And Javert resents that this one got away, but he doesn't know who it is. He doesn't know that this is Jean Valjean from years and years ago. In fact, he still assumes that that guy has, in fact, died. Remember when he got arrested again, and he rescued the man on the sailing ship, and then he dove into the water, or fell into the water, but everybody assumed he was dead, and instead he was able to escape. So Jean Valjean is certainly alive. We know that Javert thinks that he is dead at this point, but wishes that he had gotten the prisoner, quote unquote, that was in the Thénardier home, because he figures he must have been quite the crook himself. So even when Thénardier and this group are in prison, they are plotting their next crime. And they happen to be plotting the crime that is where? This house, right there. The home on Rue Plumet. Because the grate is loose. And so somehow they discover that, and they're plotting their crime. So then he gets out, and he's rescued. By rescued, I mean helped to escape. And yet in that midst of that escape, the rope that he's using to get down to the ground is too short. And so he gets stuck there on the rooftops. And of course, Javert and the other policemen are scouring the area looking for him. And there's only so long he'll be able to hold on in the place that he's at without losing all his strength and falling. And so they run and they get one of the gamin, one of the little street urchins, to come help and to rescue him, because they are small and they can scamper up usually. And it is no other than Gavroche, or Gavroche, that is called on to help rescue his father. And one of the more astounding things, and it's very sad, and we notice it, of course, and but Thénardier never notices, is as soon as he falls to the ground, he gets going, okay, now who are we going to eat? Not what are we going to eat? Now, it's not like, finally, I've gotten out of prison after all this time, let's go to the tavern and eat something. It's who is the next person we are going to devour. Take me to the crime. So we see that some people get harder and harder as time goes on. By the way, it's pretty sad here on page, if you want to look for a quote here, on page 576, one of the other criminals, bandits, Babette, took Thénardier aside. It says, "Did you notice that, Mian?" Which is the little slang language, the argot, A-R-G-O-T, argot, is the language of the street, so to speak, in Paris at this time. The street slang, you might think of. And Thénardier responds, "What Mian?" "The Mian who climbed up the wall and brought you the rope." "Not much." "Well, I don't know, but it seems to me that it is your son." "Pshaw," said Thénardier. "Do you think so?" And what a tragic comment here. He doesn't even recognize, not only does he give no thanks, but he doesn't even recognize his own son, who basically, essentially, 95% of the time lives on the street. And every once in a blue moon goes home to see how everybody's doing. Nobody cares or notices, and he leaves again. Okay. So we're seeing the hardening of Thénardier's heart. We've been seeing it all through this story, but it continues to increase so that he does not show any compassion or care really for anybody but himself, just his own rescue. He doesn't even take notice who it is that's rescuing him, nor does he think it's worthy of even a comment of gratitude. I believe in this we can learn a lesson because our hearts never stand still. They're always shifting. There's no such thing as a static person. There might be a static character in literature. That simply just means a person whose character is not shown to change within the context of the story. But that is never true in reality. In reality, we are always changing. We are changing either towards the light, towards goodness, towards softness, towards understanding, towards compassion, towards Christ, or we are changing away, turning away, allowing a root of bitterness to develop, becoming more and more wicked. Our hearts become more and more hard. Our hearts never stay still. Now, in the next section, we want to remind you what has happened between Marius and Cosette. Remember, he had first met Cosette at the Luxembourg Gardens. And she was just a young girl, and they notice each other, but there's nothing tremendous in that. And then he sees her a little bit later, and she has grown into a young lady, very beautiful. And he begins to, his heart kind of gets captured by her, and vice versa. They start to notice, and what I would call the incipient romance. Now, very shortly, he has been following her, but let's see, I just want to get this in the right order. Hang on. And he feels that he loses her entirely, and he goes into despair, and he doesn't know who she is or where she is. But then Eponine, who's much more perceptive when Marius is the neighbor of the Thénardier family, is aware when she comes to the home, sees her again as they come to help the poor family next door. And then loses her again immediately because during the midst of all that commotion and the police coming in, and well, really before, it's earlier in the day, and then she leaves, but with all that commotion, there was no reuniting again with her. He's still, what the name he has is a false name, the address is a false address, and he goes back again into despair, and Eponine has been on the lookout. She says she could help him, and she's on the lookout for where this young lady lives. So one night, Eponine accosts Marius on the street and says to follow her, that she knows where the girl he loves, or thinks he loves perhaps at this point, where she lives. So let's go to the quote on 5:14 and 5:15. And I'm going to read a fairly extensive section on these two pages, beginning about halfway down 5:14. She says to him, well, let's even go a little further up, about 1/3 of the way down. "Ah," she continues, "you have a hole in your shirt. I must mend it for you," she resumed with an expression which gradually grew darker. "You don't seem to be glad to see me." Marius said nothing. She herself was silent for a moment. Then she exclaimed, "But if I would, I could easily make you glad." "How?" inquired Marius. "What does that mean?" "Ah, you used to speak to me more kindly," she replied. "Well, what is it that you mean?" She bit her lip. She seemed to hesitate, as if passing through a kind of interior struggle. At last she appeared to decide upon her course. "Oh, so much the worse. It makes no difference. You look sad. I want you to be glad. But promise me that you will laugh. I want to see you laugh and hear you say, 'Oh, well, that is good, poor Monsieur Marius. You know, you promised me that you would give me whatever I should ask.'" "Yes, but tell me." She looked into Marius's eyes and said, "I have the address." Marius turned pale. All his blood flowed back into his heart. "What address?" "The address you asked me for." She added as if she were making an effort, "The address. You know very well, or you know well enough." "Yes," stammered Marius, "of the young lady." Having pronounced this word, she sighed deeply. Marius sprang up from the bank on which he was sitting and took her wildly by the hand. "Oh, come, show me the way. Tell me. Ask me for whatever you will. Where is it?" "Come with me," she answered. "I'm not sure of the street and number. It is way on the other side from here. But I know the house very well. I will show you." She withdrew her hand and added in a tone which would have pierced the heart of an observer, but which not even touched the intoxicated and transported Marius, "Oh, how glad you are." At the bottom of the page, she offers her money, and she says, "I don't want your money." What does she want? Did you notice? Marius did not, but did you? Oh, how glad you are. A huge amount expressed in that sentence. So here we see this tragedy of a person, hardly loved but definitely used by the father and the mother. Even the affection that the mother used to show her two oldest children, her daughters, of which Eponine was the oldest. Even that has faded with the harshness of the times and the increasing degradation of the parents. The children are used as accomplices in crimes, and perhaps even for more than that, there's a hint. And so in ways to manipulate and get money out of others. And so it's very sad. Her life is very sad. It's tragic. And yet even in the midst of that, we see her tenderness, her love. Why is she doing this for Marius? Even when she's frustrated that he's putting no notice or attentiveness on her, and that she can tell he's just morose and depressed. But guess what? Her desire to see him happy, her desire to see him have what he wants, overrides her jealousy. Isn't that interesting? As weak as her own background has been, as sad as it has been, she shows a great deal of true love, right? Of love, of unselfishness. And again, we've got this major theme, this tension between what society, how society forms, how society has formed her own society, her microcosm of society with her parents and the people she's involved with, have certainly left their bitter imprint over her, but they have not extinguished her heart. And she herself makes noble and heroic choices, of which this is one, giving the address. Or really showing him where she lives, giving Cosette's address. Sad because he doesn't notice what anybody would notice, that she just wants some love, some affection, some kindness in response. So we see a noble heart hidden in, we see this in many people. In fact, this is something you can kind of trace as a theme throughout the book, the noble heart here, hidden in Fantine, hidden in Jean Valjean, hidden in, many, but definitely here in Epoch. But he is also not going the whole way and saying that there's a noble heart in every poor person or stamped on oppressed person in society, is he? Because her father is growing in the exact opposite way. And so I think one of the things that Victor Hugo is doing throughout this book is trying to help us, the readers, think more deeply. Don't whitewash life. Don't see it on a superficial perspective. Now, the next section that we see, let's go to 520 and 521. We're going to talk about what it means to have a flashback in literature. A flashback means that the story is now going to be told for a little while out of order, taking us back to a previous place and reminding us, filling in the details of what had happened previously from where we are chronologically in the story. So if we're standing right here in the story, he looks backwards and fills in what had gone on previous. Let's look at 520. I'll read the last paragraph on the bottom of the 520 and then continuing on to finish that paragraph at the top of the next. It says, had Jean Valjean left the convent of the Petit Picpus? What had happened? Nothing had happened. As we remember, Jean Valjean was happy in the convent, so happy that his conscience at last began to be troubled. He saw Cosette every day. He felt paternity springing up and developing within him more and more. He brooded this child with his soul. He said to himself that she was his, that nothing could take her from him, that this would be so indefinitely, that certainly she would become a nun, being every day gently led on towards it, that thus the convent was henceforth the universe to her, as well as to him, that he would grow old there and she would grow up there, that she would grow old there and he would die there, that finally, ravishing hope, no separation was possible. In reflecting upon this, he at last began to find difficulties. And this is where I so appreciate Jean Valjean as a character. He's not willing to let his personal happiness and hope and dreams interfere or rob those of another. He continually has to make this choice, and he's certainly tempted to. We're all tempted to. We put our own happiness and safety and concerns above others. That is the quote-unquote natural way. That's the way of our natural mind, but it's not the most noble way. It's not the best way. And so we're forever on this journey to learn to lay aside our own. Right? So here he continues, he says, he at last began to find difficulties. He questioned himself. He asked himself if all this happiness were really his own. Brave questions, by the way, to ask yourself. Sometimes they're hard to ask, even to admit to yourself. If it were not made up of the happiness of another, of the happiness of this child whom he was appropriating and plundering, he, an old man, if this was not a robbery, He said to himself that this child had a right to know what life was before renouncing it, that to cut her off in advance and in some sort without consulting her from all pleasure under pretense of saving her from all trial, to take the advantage of her ignorance and isolation to give her an artificial vocation. He's speaking about becoming a nun and never having made the choice to leave the other paths of or options of living, was to outrage a human creature and to lie to God. And who knows but, thinking over all this some day and being a nun with regret, Cosette might even come to hate him. A final thought which was almost selfish and less heroic than the others, but which was unbearable to him. He resolved to leave the convent. Okay. So the flashback talks about Valjean's. What's been going on with Valjean and Cosette? Okay, they left the nunnery. This explains why, because he doesn't want to be selfish regarding her future, but let her choose. Then they moved to 3 homes. They had a main one, the one that they lived in much of the time, and that was the Rue Plumet, or Plumet. And then he would sometimes go to the Rue de l'Ouest. I don't know how to pronounce these. I'm not even going to try. Or the Rue, and sometimes go to the Rue de l'Homme Armé. Now why does he keep 3 residences? Because every time anything might get suspicious looking, he wants to be able to quickly move out of one and into another until things settle down again. Remember, he is a man always on the edge. Nobody's actively seeking him out as far as the law goes, but they could always recognize him. Javert could always recognize him, and he wants to keep on his caution. And so we see that we're always growing. God wants to move us into ever-increasing Christ-likeness out of selfishness. And so here he is, very happy at the convent, and yet he's motivated what? God, who's doing that? I believe the Lord does that on our hearts. He presses us. We don't recognize ourselves. In fact, David says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. See if there be any wicked way in me. Continually inspect my heart and reveal what doesn't please you, what isn't like you." Oftentimes we don't even recognize our own selfishness, but the Lord does. He understands, and he presses on us, and he brings it to our conscience, which is exactly what's happening here with Jean Valjean. Now remember, this whole section is a flashback. It is not at the point where Eponine has brought Marius to the grate, or to the house where Cosette now lives. This is all before. It's catching us up on the background. So, he moves out of the nunnery. Cosette has become a young lady. She recognizes her own beauty now, and that's kind of this awakening that happens, that you can have an effect, so to speak, on another's heart, and you start recognizing that she is beautiful, and she has become a lady. Marius and Cosette now meet one another again at Luxembourg Gardens. This is part of the flashback. And it's at this point that they fall in love. And this is where they they have all these secret little smiles and glances, and they don't do much, but they notice each other, and it's the kind of notice that changes your life. Okay. And they know that they are falling in love, because he says there's something about lovers, they want to hide it from the old man. Okay. They don't want anybody to threaten it. Well, Jean Valjean becomes cautious, and he moves out of the home they were staying in that brief period called the Rue de Laust. So Marius had followed them, knew where she was living, kind of would gaze out at the window, and then all of a sudden, in a very short period of time, they've disappeared. Nobody knows where they've gone, and oh no, he has lost her. Okay. So Valjean becomes cautious and jealous, and they move. Not jealous like one lover to another, but jealous because he's threatened that he would lose Cosette. And they move. So this becomes a theme that he doesn't want. We could feel like we've given up everything for the Lord, and yet there are certain things that we just do not want to lose. We hold on too tightly to. And this is becoming that for him. Well, 3 more months go by. And he has moved to another one of his homes, and he offers, do you want to go to Luxembourg Gardens again? Because he notices she's become quieter, more withdrawn, more silent, pale physically. And he notices, that means Valjean notices that Cosette is unhappy. He suspects, but he asks, do you want to go to the garden? And she says yes, but Marius is not there. Why is he not there? Because 3 whole months have gone by. He went and went and went. She never came back, and he's more now in deep sadness. They're both in deep sadness. But watch this on page 529. Beginning about the middle of the page, it says, still she did not let, speaking of Cosette, Jean Valjean see anything except her paleness. She kept her face sweet for him. This paleness was more than sufficient to make Jean Valjean anxious. Sometimes he asked her, what is the matter with you? She answered, nothing. And after a silence, as she felt that he was sad also, she would continue, and you, Father, is not something the matter with you? Me? Nothing, he said. These 2 beings who had loved each other so exclusively and with so touching a love, and who had lived so long for each other, were now suffering by each other and through each other, without speaking of it, without harsh feeling, and smiling the while. Really a very perceptive comment, a wonderful phrase, I think, in literature, reminding us that they are both suffering but silent. Now, why are we silent with those we love? Have you ever thought about that? Because we don't want to increase. Sometimes we don't want to put our sorrow on another. So it is out of love. Do you know that love has this funny thing to it often? I mean, there's a beauty in love, and there's happiness in love, like in few other things. And I'm not just speaking just only of romantic love, or I'm speaking of love in all its dimensions. There's beauty, there's happiness, there's joy, there's tenderness. There's some of the very best of all emotions of life are to be found in love. But did you realize that love also has suffering? There's a suffering in love. Why is that? Have you ever stopped to think? Because, you see, love is, maybe, could I say it's the opening, the biggest opening of the human heart is found in love. Okay. We could think on every plane. Love in friendship, love in family, love in romance, love with God. We open our heart in love. in a way it normally is not, in a vulnerable, a deeply vulnerable way. The deeper our love, the deeper our vulnerability. And because of that, there is a suffering. Even if the other person doesn't, quote unquote, betray us. Nobody but God meets those expectations that we have in our heart fully. Right? We feel ourselves drift. We feel other things. Come in, there's just so much. There's such a depth to this. But I want you to understand something, and that is that love doesn't mean you're never silent. And it doesn't mean you'll always be happy and there'll be no suffering. In fact, it's the opposite. Love is the place of greatest vulnerability in our lives. And because it is that, there will always be some suffering mixed with it. Now, some people respond to that by saying, well, I'll never love, or I'll never love again. And let me suggest that I think that's a poor choice. You lose too much with a decision like that. Don't go there. But love is a hard place. And it doesn't mean we stop loving somebody because we experience pain in the midst of it. That doesn't have to be either. Okay. Now remember, this whole thing's a flashback, and we also remember that then we've had the Thénardier experience where Valjean wounds himself to show that they cannot threaten him. And during that time, that month where he is suffering from his wound, he and Cosette draw close together again. And of course, we're speaking about Jean Valjean and Cosette. And so he says on 533, Cosette dressed it night and morning, that would be his wound, with so divine a grace and so angelic a pleasure in being useful to him that Valjean felt all his old happiness return. His fears and his anxieties dissipate, and he looked upon Cosette, saying, "Oh, the good wound, oh, the kind hurt." Beautiful statement, and isn't it true in our lives as well, that sometimes the pain, sometimes a hurt, sometimes an injury, whether it be physical, emotional, sometimes an injury can be a great healing to us. So I'll leave you to reflect on that. Let me write the quote. Now to finish up, meanwhile, okay, now we're finished with our flashback, and now once Marius has been shown the way to Cosette's house at the Rue Plumet, he stands outside, he gets to know her, he looks at the grate, he stands in the garden under the night, and eventually he gets a little bit bolder and a little bit bolder, right? And he leaves a letter under a rock. And the letter is a love letter. And she finds it, reads it, and knows immediately. Her heart knows who it is. And so we're going to look at the quote on 544. It says, "Now these pages, from whom could they come? Who could have written them?" Cosette did not hesitate for a moment. One single man. Where did they come from? He. They don't even know each other's names. And then on 547, it says, when they had finished, when they had told each other everything, so they finally sit, they meet face to face. They have one kiss, then they don't have another. Just one simple, pure, and holy kiss. And then they sit and talk and share their lives together, their stories together. In fact, he says, really pretty wording. He says, these two parts poured themselves out into each other so that at the end of an hour, it was the young man who had the young girl's soul, and the young girl who had the soul of the young man. They interpenetrated, they enchanted, they dazzled each other. And this is what happens really in romance, in love, is often the souls feel this true. We speak of the union of the souls. You feel one with that person. Now you've never met another person whose heart reflects yours so closely. Then let's see. When they had finished, when they had told each other everything, she laid her head upon his shoulder and asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Marius," he said. "And yours?" "My name is Cosette." Really delightful. They did in all this time even know each other's names. So they become this oneness of soul. So we're going to stop here and take this up with a part 2.